My mother died in 2003, and when I received the word that her 2 weeks of anguished suffering in a hospital ICU had ended, I headed straight for the Gethsemane Monastery in Kentucky, which was near my family home. And I spent a couple of days there just remembering my mother as I prepared to deliver her eulogy. I remembered visiting her childhood home in Appalachia, where my grandparents at that time still lived. The home was modernized in many ways, but you could still see the vestiges of what life had been like for her when she was a young girl. They didn't use them anymore, but the old oil lamps were still visible around the house. My mother grew up without electricity, and there was an outhouse in the backyard, and she had a chamber pot under her bed for those late night necessary moments. There was still a washstand in her old bedroom with the large porcelain bowl that was used for bathing. There was a hand pump over the cistern off the back porch where they got their water. There was still a chicken coop and a small fenced field where they kept a dairy cow and a horse. And there were gardens scattered about where there was good light for the vegetable gardens. That may sound very nice in some ways, but trust me, the advent of indoor plumbing, electric lights, gas heat, refrigeration, and electric washing machines and dryers, along with grocery stores that actually remained stocked with meat, milk, eggs, and bread, were innovations not to be sneezed at. As I considered the changes in the world from the time that my mother had been a child into the 21st century when she died, it seemed almost impossible that the world could have changed that much in a single lifetime. She left Appalachia to go to Washington, D.C. during the war to be a congressional secretary. She sat in a warehouse-sized room full of desks with women pounding away at manual typewriters, pounding out the correspondence that kept our federal government working through the World War. After the war, she married my father, had 4 children, and became the secretary of our home church. She kept that job until she retired, when it became time that she would have to learn how to operate a computer, and that was one change too many for her. When she died, I was the pastor of a large denominational church. I had 3 secretaries managing my correspondence, record keeping, bookkeeping, and such, all tasks that within a very few years after I left there were whittled down to one part-time job and several software pieces. Much of the innovation and change of my mother's life were the result of the war. There were a lot of advances in technology made during World War II. There were a lot of social advances made during the Civil Rights Movement. And then the globalization of a growing world population just brought change after change after change. We have just now endured 17 more days, a relatively brief period of reversals under a reactionary presidential administration who seemed to be determined to drag us all back into the 1950s. We really have walked right up to the precipice of a new dark ages in which science was suspect and conspiracy theories became factual. An anti-educational, anti-democratic, and decidedly favoring a reinstitution of a sharply divided class and race caste system that serves only a fraction of our society at the expense of all the rest of us. Now I believe we really are standing on the threshold of a season of progress that will rival the changes in my mother's generation. She could have never imagined what her life in her 80s would be like when she was in her 20s. We're now at one of those places in history where it's almost impossible for us to imagine how even the next 10 and 20 years are going to change the world that we live in. And change is not always good. Technological advances can be labor-saving, they can be life-enhancing, and they can be crushing. When I went to the Gethsemane Monastery to think and pray when my mother died 18 years ago, it was still the largest Trappist monastery in the country. I suspect in another 10 years, it will be the only Trappist monastery in the country. And in 10 more years, it will not exist. The monastic life that I once admired, studied, wrote about, just doesn't make sense to our generation. And monastic houses will be turned into virtual nursing homes over the next few years. We are now, hopefully at least, coming to an end to the first global pandemic in the past century. It was a pandemic that caught most of the world by surprise. But in much the way that World War II pushed the development of aviation and communication, the pandemic has inspired a renewed investment in medicine. Working vaccines were developed and deployed in 10 months' time. That is a modern miracle, and it was inspired by necessity. There will be more, and there will be more deadly viruses in the future, but the medical advances made in the last year will make the next vaccine much easier to produce. Having nailed down this technology for wiring RNA, transfer RNA, to teach our bodies to resist a new virus, it is possible that the next vaccine will be developed in weeks and that we may never have to fear another global pandemic. We talk about a lot of things that need to change, but there always seems to be a need for some swift kick in the pants to actually get us going, to apply those sciences and that technology to a current problem. And I want to say, before I wander into my crystal ball reflections, it is always dangerous to assume that there will be a technological solution to every problem that we create. We sometimes play really fast and loose with our environment, with our food sources, with our personal health, always assuming that medicine or science or technology will solve the problem in the distant future. And that has not always been true. There is not always a laboratory in some Ivy League university that is going to rescue us from our self-condemning actions. However, if you'll let me indulge myself in a little almost Pollyannish predictions about the future, we've been talking for years about our need to cut back carbon production and to keep carbon in the ground, stop using fossil fuels because of what we are doing to the environment. And what we have done is not going to be erased anytime in the next century or two. Most of what we've done is talk about it. But if you ask yourself, where does carbon come from? You look at this graph. About 1/4 of all the carbon in the air comes from automobiles, a lot of which are just sitting idling on congested freeways in major cities. Another 1/4 comes from generating electricity by burning coal or gas or other fossil fuels. When my mom was young, the promising means of transportation was on trains and in trolleys, but they were put out of business because of the profit motive of making automobiles, paving more roads, and of course, even though we always talked about making them more efficient, whenever there would be a drop in oil prices, cars got bigger and faster and less efficient. Even in the last few years, the Trump administration rolled back goals and regulations that governed the amount of emissions that we were putting into the air. But gas-powered cars are on their way out. They are just about done. Several manufacturers, Volvo, for example, simply not going to make any more gas-powered engines. Everything is going to become electric. And that new electric technology is intersecting with the development of artificial intelligence so that by the time most of us have an all-electric car, it will also drive itself. And while there will be accidents, there will be fewer accidents. There will be probably an immediate reduction of 90% of our fatal traffic accidents, but they will continue to learn. They will get better and better. That is the nature of artificial intelligence, that it also learns from experience. And what's more, most of us won't even need to own a car. We won't need to have parking garages in downtown. We won't need to have big parking lots at churches and shopping centers. We won't even need a garage on our home. We'll hail a robotic car from an app on our phone, and then when we get in, we'll tell it where we want to go, and it will take us there. Without an Uber driver who insists on telling us about their tragic life and how desperately they need a huge tip. Imagine how many people have been forced to live in nursing homes because they could no longer function living independently. What if a trip to the store, the mall, the church, to see the grandkids was simply a matter of telling the car where to take them? That's 25% of our carbon emissions that will immediately be eradicated by electric cars. At the same time, renewable energy has, in just the last year, since last July, it is now officially cheaper to produce electricity through either wind or solar than it is to produce it by burning coal or gas. There was a very feverish public meeting with our former city utilities director, John Twitty, about 20 years ago, where the public had voted against building a new coal-fired plant, and they decided they found a way to ignore the vote and do it anyway. Sort of rings true of current presidential stuff, doesn't it? But there was a public meeting at which John Twitty, who was a friend of my family actually, was going to field responses from the public. And I told him at the time that if they proceeded to build another coal-fired electric generation plant, that it would be one of the last coal-fired plants built in the world, because it would quickly become not only the most dangerous health hazards from coal ash, but it would also become the most expensive way to generate electricity. And Mr. Twitty looked at me and said, "Well, that's your opinion." As of last July, Mr. Twitty, it is no longer just my opinion, it also happens to be true. Now, we can do better by leaving more carbon in the ground by changing some of our agricultural methods. We are learning to grow crops without having to till the soil. We could get better at capturing carbon emissions from our beef operations. Of course, we could also get a little smarter and not eat so much beef. But the United States, I predict, will cut its carbon emissions by half in the next 10 to 12 years. Not because we're good people, and not because preaching has finally found the audience to convince people to make changes, but because renewable energy and electric cars are going to be cheaper and more efficient. Leave it to us to do the right thing when we can make money from doing the right thing. Echoes of Winston Churchill's observation that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they have tried everything else. While we have just survived 4 years of a reactionary government that tried to take us backwards, Japan has been forging ahead in cleaner energy and setting goals even more ambitious. I think we're going to reduce our carbon emissions by at least 50%. But Prime Minister Suga, in a policy speech he delivered just in October, pledged to achieve zero carbon emissions within 30 years. And he's insisting that they just get all the gas-burning cars off the road in the next few years and then switch industry to being powered on hydrogen fuel cells, which was suggested in terms of technology 25 years ago. We just never got around to making hydrogen fuel cells. But now that it's time to do it, and the exchange from using that kind of energy will basically help us to create more air. We should have switched to electric cars and renewable energy a long time ago. 10 years ago, we could have done it. but we lacked the political and the moral will to do it. But now the technology has made it cheaper. I got to ride in a fully electric Tesla a few months ago, which already has partially self-driving programming in it, and that computer program will simply be updated as it becomes ready, and it will be a fully self-driving car. Very few months from now, we will see more and more cars on the road that does not have an active driver. Of course, the growth of AI will bring both life-enhancing changes as well as many economic and social changes that will require that we show some flexibility and some compassion in how we reshape our economy. Did you know it's already difficult to recruit people to take driver training to drive semi-trailer trucks? As many semi-trailer trucks as are on the road right now, the industry is aware that in a very few years, maybe 2 or 3 years, those trucks will be self-driving. There will not be any more truck drivers who make a career out of truck driving. Taxi drivers, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, those jobs are all going away. And for all the noise about restoring coal mining jobs that Donald Trump made a few years ago, he was either lying or he was totally unaware that we're not going to be burning coal much longer, and hardly anybody goes into a mine to mine anymore. Mining is done by robots. The same is true in most of manufacturing. It will be unnerving when we go to the airport and board an airplane that has no pilots. But even now, pilots are almost useless in commercial aircraft. Most mundane and repetitive jobs will be replaced by mechanization very soon. But also, very many technical jobs, such as architecture, will be accomplished by a computer program. Just as my mother worked in a warehouse-sized typing pool in 1943, there were hotel and retail businesses, even here in town, that had similar warehouses full of architects working on their construction projects. At this point, every active full-time architect in Springfield, Missouri could meet around a conference table. From farming to even a lot of medical surgery, artificial intelligence and robots will reduce the need for human expertise or human labor, all the way from picking oranges to delivering babies. If it is done correctly, this will make our lives much better, freeing us up to not flip hamburgers, but to become artists, sculptors, musicians, painters. But if we do it with the kind of Darwinian capitalism, it will create an ocean of poverty. It will create unemployment. It could literally turn democracies into feudal states where there are a handful of lords and hordes of peasants. Those who have anything worth stealing will find themselves living behind locked fences and gates with security systems, probably robotic security systems, but it is not going to be a pleasant universe if we don't alter capitalism so that it actually distributes resources. Now is the time when our moral decision-making needs to get ahead of our technological advances. We don't wait until we have droves of unemployed. Just as we switch from gas burning to electric vehicles, the environment will get better, the economy will be fueled, but it must come hand in hand with a universal basic income that is paid to every adult in the country. That is the only way that we will be able to deal with massive excesses in available labor without an economic collapse that would lead to a collapse of democracy. While our Senate is today busy debating whether Americans should get a $600 stimulus check or a $2,000 stimulus check. I'm telling you what they really need to be discussing is how much of a check everyone needs to get every month from now on. Very soon, those who cannot make ends meet with one job will not be able to just go out and pick up a few shifts as an Uber driver because the Ubers will drive themselves. They won't be able to get a second job at McDonald's because even those jobs will be done by robots. This transition will not be easy and it won't happen overnight, but we can see it happening along the fringes of our economy already. We've got to get compassion back into government. We've got to get compassion back into our economic system. Right now, the fight is in the Senate. And you remember a year ago, this month, we had more than 20 candidates running for the Democratic nomination. 6 of those candidates are still members of the United States Senate. These 6 allies, these people that we would turn to for fighting for social justice, forward-looking leaders who understand what is at stake, how many of those 6 senators have you heard advocating for a $2,000 stimulus check? Now, I admit, I may have missed it, but I haven't heard a word out of Amy Klobuchar. I haven't heard a word out of Kristen Gillibrand. Not even Cory Booker. I haven't heard a word about this from Kamala Harris. And for God's sake, not even Elizabeth Warren. Now, I'm not trying to relitigate a primary that's been over for months. And I obviously know that Bernie Sanders will never be a candidate again. But look at who is carrying our flag on the Senate floor. This battle for economic justice for the poor and the working class, this particular battle has already been lost. Most of the time when you see Bernie charging into battle, he's lost before he gets out of his seat. But I am just so glad that this old crazy Jewish socialist from Vermont is still saying exactly what needs to be said. Because men and women over the next 20 years, this battle is going to be fought over and over and over again. And the charge will be led by people whose names we don't know yet. Because the people that are currently in the Senate are not doing it. But this battle must be won because we cannot afford to lose it. If we lose this battle, everyone loses, even the rich. Now, Bernie can't lead this charge, but someone's got to. Science and technology can deliver us to a new world of effective vaccines, self-driving cars, of robotic farming, cooking, cleaning, and even construction. But whether this world that AI will bring us will be heaven or hell, that is up to us. We will find that we have sufficient natural resources for the technological transformation to renewable energy, as well as renewable housing, and we will be able to feed everyone in the world. The only resource that we are lacking right now is moral courage. Moral courage among our leaders. Left up to our current body of Congress and senators, capitalism will turn our mechanized future into wealth for a few and crushing poverty for almost everyone else. I'm sorry, folks, there is not an app for that, and AI isn't going to fix that. Creating a great society requires moral vision and courageous leaders. Now, hundreds of people are going to hear this message the first week of 2021. Thousands and maybe tens of thousands will hear it by the end of 2021. But I want you to understand, I am talking to you. Just you. Just you. The world is waiting for you to bear the standard of justice and compassion into a new world that, quite frankly, is already loaded into the back of a self-driving Amazon.com truck somewhere, and it is heading out to your neighborhood. You have to make the future a blessing, or I guarantee you it will be a curse. Now, I'm going to keep preaching as long as I have an audience. But you already know what I'm going to say. I'm just going to keep finding different ways to tell you what I've been telling you for years. Get off your ass and lead.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.